Nice to be together with all of you tonight and back for another session of learning. Sorry that I missed our last session. I was a bit under the weather that day. So we'll just pick back up. And it meant that it's been a month since we've all been together. So um, the material that I have for tonight, my records say that I used last in May of 2020. So some of us who have been at this a long time may have seen this stuff before, but my memory doesn't extend back more than a couple of weeks, and particularly over the last 3 years, everything that far back is pretty fuzzy. So apologies if you have seen these sources, if you were people who we've been learning together for a while. But I was thinking about my essential texts, as is the brief for this class, and I could not teach essential texts without my guy, the heretic of the Talmud. So we're going to look at some Elisha ben Abuya texts together. We're going to look at the texts of the most famous heretic in Jewish history until Baruch Spinoza, and all of it's forming, I guess, for me, an interesting picture of myself as I'm going through these texts and seeing which ones are coming together. I'm getting a little psychoanalysis going. And my texts have been clustering around doubt and wrestling. That's not maybe surprising, but it's becoming very, very clear. 2 sessions ago, we looked at the text of Moses on the mountain wanting to see God's face and only seeing God's back, and the commentary of Professor Ehrlich, who said, better to spend 1 hour in tshuva and good deeds in this world than all of the world to come. Why? Because in the world to come, all the questions are answered, and what's the fun of that? Then the last time we were together, we were deep in Maimonides, a unique kind of Jewish thinker, both the greatest Jewish legal mind and philosopher ever, and also a man whose books were burned by other Jews for their implications about the reconciliation of science and religion and the necessity of understanding that we're using metaphorical language when we talk about God, who is always bigger. And, I think all of this comes from my strange biography of a person raised in a deeply culturally Jewish home, but a completely atheist home, falling in love with traditional Jewish text and going to rabbinical school and becoming what my job description says is a spiritual leader, but having some deep and fundamental wrestlings with what that first word of spiritual is supposed to mean. And so gravitating toward other figures in our Jewish story who have given me permission to be a wrestler along with them, who've said, your doubts are welcome here and your questions are welcome here, and you're in good company. And so I rely on them to make me feel comfortable walking in the world as a religious Jew. And I always feel honored to get to share these teachers who walk with me. Elisha ben Abuya is a rabbi that most people know about through a 20th century novel called As a Driven Leaf. It was written by a rabbi named Milton Steinberg, who was the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, one of the flagship synagogues of the conservative movement in New York. He wrote As a Driven Leaf in his 30s. He wrote it partially reflecting on the legacy of his teacher, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, went on to found the Reconstructionist movement, and certainly a man of doubt and questions. Rabbi Steinberg died tragically very young, in his early 40s. He left behind some extraordinary sermons, the most extraordinary of which is a sermon called To Hold with Open Arms. That is absolutely one of my core texts, and maybe worthy of us studying it together in a different sort of text than we've looked at, which he wrote after surviving his first heart attack, and talking about an attitude toward life, which is both, or rather is neither about a sort of classical Zen Buddhist letting go, nor a tight clinging, but what he calls holding with open arms, an embrace of the world, an embrace of life, an embrace of the here and now and the messy reality of it, and also a light holding, knowing that it's all only very temporary. It's a really beautiful reflection on mortality, and one that I come back to quite often. As a Driven Leaf was a novel set in the time of the Talmud. It is the most extraordinary book for bringing the Talmud to life, giving a sense of the rich personality of these characters who we encounter in fragments of their debates and discussions, filling out their personality, bringing together all of the many details scattered across dozens of volumes to give them richness and character. And it focuses in on one particular rabbi, Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, often referred to in the Talmud simply by the word acher, which means the other one. Elisha ben Abuya is said to have been the child of a wealthy and not particularly religious family. He was said to have been a prodigy, a student along with the other great teachers of his day, a student of Rabbi Joshua, who is famous for the oven of Achnai story that many of us know, in which he stood up and told God, the Torah is not in heaven, ordained as a rabbi, but who ultimately found that his questions led him away from a path of faith and led him to challenge the teachings that he had been given and challenge the positions of those who had formerly been his colleagues. What's fascinating about Elisha ben Abuya, most of all, is that we know about him at all. What most religious traditions do with their heretics is they burn them. And if they somehow escape the fate of death, they certainly are erased. They are wiped clean from the history records. And instead of doing that, the Talmud records Elisha ben Abuya's opinions right alongside those of his colleagues who are on the inside. They preserve the traditions even of the heretic, even of the one who challenged it all. And doesn't that say kind of everything about the Talmudic tradition? That it celebrates debate even to the point of including the one who has completely departed, because his voice is a necessary corrective, as we're going to see, on many of the places in which religion can very easily go wrong. So we're going to look at a series of texts about Elisha that try to answer the question of what drove Elisha away from Judaism, what drove him away from the community, what drove him to heresy. And what I think we're going to see as we look in each of these texts, we're going to see some of the implicit dangers in religion. We're going to see some of the places in which religion can go off the rails if we're not careful with it. And we're going to see in the example of Elisha, somebody who recognized the tension and saw only one option, and that option was to walk away. And what I have sort of staked my own personal and professional life on, and I know many of you have as well, is the idea that one can face down these questions, and rather than walk away, one can face down these questions and lean in more deeply. So Elisha is ultimately a tragic character to me because he recognizes these pain points in religion and he can't integrate them. He can't get past them. He feels that he needs to walk away. I think that there's something so honest and also so tragic in that. And he is, for me, a reminder both of the ways in which religion can go wrong if unchecked or unquestioned, and also of the commitment that I've made to not turn around and walk away, but rather to lean in to those moments that are sometimes the hardest. So we're going to look at texts together. There are a collection of them. Notice how many we'll get through in the next 45 minutes, but it should be good fun. Hoping that you can see my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Excellent. Great, and let me make it a little bit bigger. Try at least, there we go. All right. How does a rabbi become a heretic? Stories of Elisha ben Abuya. This first story is a story that those of you who took the Intro to Judaism class with me, we studied when we looked at the section on Kabbalah. It's the big red warning label on the cover of Jewish mysticism, the story about rabbis who engage in mystical speculation and find that it leaves them, at least most of them, in a bad place. So the text begins. This is a text from the Talmud, Tractate Hagiga. The sages taught, four enter the orchard, and they are as follows. Entering the orchard is a euphemism for engaged in mystical speculation. The term orchard or pardes is a word that gets used connected to mysticism a great deal. Pardes is also interestingly used as an acronym for the four different levels of Torah study. Shat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. The surface meaning, the allegorical meaning, the contextual meaning, and the secret mystical meaning. So four enter into the orchard, four engage in some kind of mystical practice. We don't know exactly what kind of practice they were engaging in, but some sort of meditation, some sort of ecstatic activity. And they were as follows. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma, Acher, the other, a name for Elisha ben Abuya, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai peeked at the divine presence, and he died. This is an Icarus kind of myth, right? The one who flies too close to the sun and finds that they go crashing down. Ben Azai gets a peek at God and dies. We looked at the text 2 sessions ago that said, no one can see my face and live. Ben Zoma peeked at the divine presence and was damaged, i.e. he lost his mind. And with regard to him, the verse states, have you found honey? Eat as much as is sufficient for you, lest you become full of it and vomit it. Ben Zoma lives, but he is altered by the process. He is damaged by the process. He loses his facilities. Have you found honey? Have you found something sweet? Don't take too much, because too much will harm you. And we're going to come back to that quote again at the very end, and a very interesting take on all of this from Maimonides. Acher, chop down the young plants. Chop down the young plants. This is a euphemistic reference to heresy. Who are the young plants? The young plants are the students, and Acher was the one who disillusioned students with his questions and his heretical opinions. So Acher comes out of this mystical experience, and he becomes a heretic and one who challenges the beliefs of others. And Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and came out in peace. And for those who need the context, Rabbi Akiva is, of course, the most famous, the greatest rabbi of his generation. And so the way that this functions as a warning label on the study of Kabbalah is to say, essentially, if you want to study Kabbalah, unless you think that you're a Rabbi Akiva type, you should probably stay away. If you have reached the level of the greatest of your generation, then maybe you can enter into the orchard. But much more likely, you're going to wind up dead, crazy, or at very least, chopping down the young plants, a heretic. What was it that led him to heresy? What was it that led Acher away? He saw the angel Metatron, who was granted permission to sit and write the merits of Israel. So in this ecstatic vision, he encounters God's leading angel, the Metatron. And he said, there's a tradition that in the world above, there's no sitting, no competition, no turning one's back before God. All face the divine presence and no lethargy. Nobody needs to sit down. Seeing that someone other than God was seated above, he said, perhaps there are two authorities in heaven. I'm curious what you think, and let's have some discussion about the specific image that they offer of what it was that drove Acher away, this image of an angel and the questions of maybe there are two authorities in heaven, or more generally, what is it about mystical speculation that's a place where religion can go wrong or can lead people astray? So either the specifics of this image of the Metatron, or more generally, how can mysticism be dangerous? I'm going to stop share so we can see each other's face a little bit. Yeah, would love to get some voices.
Quick question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
What is lethargy? That kind of
Tiredness.
rang true, but I just
Tiredness. Metatron was sitting down. It's heaven. Shouldn't he be standing up? Why does he need to be sitting?
right. That got me going with that. Okay.
What is something? Leah, please.
I think this is something about that the orchard is sealed off from other human beings. The four rabbis enter it. I'm thinking of this in comparison to the four children of the Seder. You have four children that are going to ask the four questions. I guess they're the four, at one time they were the four boys, the good one, the wise one, the one that says, what does this have to do with me? The one that doesn't know how to ask the question, or what's the question? Who cares? And then there are the surrounding experienced adults and or teachers that are going to use the questions to really start the Seder off. Now the party begins till 3:00 in the morning. We're going to tell the story one more time to answer your questions. I think that is somehow what I will call a healthy encounter with the orchard, a less dangerous one, certainly, a less fraught with danger. But it's just these four guys going in alone without relation to what I'll call regular people that I think we're being warned against. The air can get pretty thin in what I will call intellectual circles of any field. And I think maybe especially around Torah study.
Wow. So if I can paraphrase, Lee, and tell me if I've got this right, that religion is dangerous when practiced outside of the context of community. When practiced in small, either in isolation or in small group of like-minded individuals divorced from a broader context, religion can very quickly spin into something which can make you crazy, or can drive you away, or might even become dangerous to your life or the life of others. And we've seen that, right? That's the tactic of cultish religious groups to isolate and to create a closed system in which religion can often be used to drive people either to violence directed outside or violence directed toward the self. Interesting. Sharon and Tom.
I approach it as thinking that when you enter the orchard, you have to be prepared to see things that you might not think you're going to see, and understand if Metatron is connected to God so closely, whatever he's doing is the proper thing to be doing. So you're just there to observe, you're not there to judge.
And so how is that a warning about a place in which religion could go wrong, or a way of doing religion which could take you down a wrong path?
If you just accept what somebody said the meaning was supposed to be, and don't just shut up and observe, then you're going to get into trouble, because it takes time to interpret new experiences that you have. And who are you to say what goes on in holy ground? That's what I'm saying.
Interesting. Thank you. Tom, please.
To the extent that the orchard is a stand-in for mystical experience, the visceral, the depth of the personal connection to the divine understanding of the world changes the psychological stakes. One can sit here in this room, I mean, in these rooms, and dispassionately talk about the challenges of understanding omniscience in a world with free will, omnibenevolence in a world with where bad things appear to happen. But that's an intellectual analysis. If you are experiencing the divine interrelationship with the world, a world that appears to be flawed and has challenges and contradictions in it, and you are experiencing that in a deep emotional sense, perhaps in under the influence of an ecstatic phenomenon that separates your distinction between self and the rest of the world, as might be induced by any number of different mystical processes. That tension, those conflicts, those challenges are harder to disentangle intellectually, and having to grapple with them in that much more intimate way could be an extremely stressful experience. And the difference between I really like the coming in peace and leaving in peace as the contradistinction, because that suggests a non-judgmental willingness to experience whatever that heightened experience of the world is, and to internalize it as an experience that can subsequently inform those many other writings and pieces of work, rather than feeling that tension, feeling those challenges. Especially, I particularly think about the Odyssey because that's the one that occurs to me most substantially whenever I think about the divine. But there are many other logistical challenges that, if you're facing them on a deeply emotional level, can be a lot more stressful than dealing with them on an intellectual, analytical level, on which we often deal with things, especially in a study-based, text-based sort of tradition.
Rabbi Akiva enters in peace and leaves in peace. And there's a commentary that says he is able to do that because he entered in order to leave, because his intention wasn't to stay in that state of ecstatic mystical union. His intention was to go in order to learn from it and come back to the world. And that need to stay grounded in the face of religious experience, which can take somebody to places from which it is difficult to come back, if entered into fully, is an appropriate caution about the powerful dangers of spiritual experimentation. That we need to make sure that we are grounded, lest these experiences pull us out of our ability to function in the world. I can't remember, I feel somehow like this came up in the script not long ago, but if it did, forgive me. You know that the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur to stand in the presence of God and say God's personal name in order to bring forgiveness to the people. And the tradition was that he entered into the Holy of Holies with a rope around his leg, so that if he did it wrong and died in there, he could be pulled out. There's a Hasidic teacher who says that wasn't the purpose of the rope. The purpose of the rope wasn't to yank out his dead body from the room that nobody could enter into. The purpose wasn't for if it went wrong. The purpose was for if it went truly right. Because if the high priest entered into the Holy of Holies, said the name of God, and had an experience of God directly, he might never leave. Why would you leave? If you're in that room with God, why would you ever come back to the rest of us? But the high priest had a job to do. That was shared with me by a rabbi named Dan Graber at the end of a really amazing experience I had in the summer before starting rabbinical school at a program called Lishma. That was a 4-week study program up at Camp Ramah. And he talked to us about the need to leave at the end, to leave this little bubble of spiritual exploration that we had been in for 4 weeks, and to go back out into the world and to say, these experiences, these types of experiences are only good if you can end them and carry with you what you learned as opposed to becoming stuck in them. Let's take a look at the next text. It is, not surprisingly, a theodicy text, a text about life's unfairness. This text comes not from the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which is the one we typically study, but from the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. And it's another take on what drove Elisha ben Abuya to become Acher. What did Acher see that made him go wrong? It is said that once, while sitting in the valley of Ginosar, that is up near the Sea of Galilee, he saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree on Shabbat, take the mother bird with the young, and descend in safety. Here's somebody who has violated Shabbat and also violated the commandment that you may know from the book of Deuteronomy, not to take the mother bird together with her eggs at the same time. At the end of Shabbat, he saw another man climb to the top of the palm tree, take the young, but let the mother bird go free. As he descended, a snake bit him, and he died. So here Acher saw somebody doing the wrong thing, 2 wrong things, in fact, tree climbing on Shabbos, taking the mother bird and its eggs, and all just went fine, and then witnessing somebody immediately following doing all the right things, waiting until the end of Shabbat, shooing away the mother bird, and as he goes down, he dies. Elisha exclaimed, "It's written, let the mother go and take only the young, that you may fare well and have a long life." This is one of only 2 commandments in the Torah that have this promise associated with them. If you do this, you will have a long life. Shooing away the mother bird and honoring of parents. Where is the well-being of this man, and where is the prolonging of his life? Some say that Elisha became a heretic when he saw, and this is a graphic image, a pig dragging along in its mouth the tongue of the famous sage Rabbi Yehuda, who had been martyred. He said then, "This is the tongue from which pearls of purest ray used to come forth all its days. Is this Torah, and is this its reward? It appears that there is no reward and no resurrection of the dead." Immediately he resolved to commit sin. He went out and seeing a prostitute beckoned to her. She asked, "Are you not Elisha ben Abuya?" I love that the prostitutes in all these stories always know the rabbis. They're always like the best Jews. It was Shabbat, and he pulled a radish out of a furrow and gave it to her. So he violates Shabbat in her presence. And so she said, he is clearly Acher, another. He's become someone else. So the first theory of what brings Elisha out of the rabbinic conversation is that he engages in this mystical speculation. He goes to these places which are apart from the world. He does so in isolation, perhaps. He loses his sense of connection to reality. He loses his ability to continue on in the work that he had committed to do. This next set of possibilities is about witnessing life's unfairness, seeing firsthand that the evil, or in this case, at least the Shabbos breakers and mother bird takers, often prosper, and that those who are promised long life, if we take the Torah literally, are not always given long life. That those who, in the case of Rabbi Yehuda, had been a teacher and a sage might wind up in a state of utter indignity. This resonates hard, I think, with a lot of us. it's very, very hard to maintain a connection to religion in a world that is so deeply, deeply broken, in which reward and punishment are clearly not operating on any moral framework that makes sense to any of us if they are operating at all. I'm wondering if there are reactions to this text. What do you see in Alicia's witnessing of life's unfairness and its bringing him away? And what do you see in that, again, of a danger potentially associated with religion, something which we need to be cautious to avoid, or to name at least, to talk about? Curious your reactions. Let's get some new voices in here.
Can I
Yeah.
speak?
Dan, great, and then Evan next.
One thing I noticed in this story, and granted, like, it may not be the whole story, but there's sort of one little vignette about, an unfairness or an inverted morality, like where somebody did something wrong and was not punished, and then somebody did something right and was punished. And that's like, depending on how you look at it, like one data point or two data points. And so I guess the scientist in me would say, like, it's not necessarily so responsible to determine your whole outlook on on life based on just such a small data set. And maybe, if Aher had looked at other moral events around him, he would have seen, like, oh, maybe there is a preponderance that people who are doing the right thing are rewarded and people who are doing the wrong thing are not rewarded, or something like that.
From his small corner of the world, and from the particular incident that he saw, he draws a quite large generalization about how the whole world and God works. And there is always the temptation to do that from our small vantage point. One could ask the question of, well, given that we are limited and we're always going to have a small vantage point, what else do we have to go off of other than our experiences? And witnessing, why does there need to be thousands and millions of events of moral unfairness in order to call into question God? Isn't one enough if one human being is a whole world? But sure, that overgeneralization is a danger zone. Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Evan, and then we'll keep going for the hands.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking a similar thing of, he only has one picture of this interaction. And, when your theology becomes too linear and there's too direct a connection between, good deeds and results, it seems like it makes all of the other questioning unnecessary. And then it makes the observer sort of godlike in a sense of, well, great, good things happened. I clearly this was the right path, and I know what's right, and you become judge, jury, and executioner of other people's interactions. And I think it lacks some humility that probably keeps us sane, to assume too direct a connection.
Thanks, Evan. Jeff?
Well, perhaps the fault lies with Alicia, because just as he did with the situation with Metatron, he's only seen the shot. He's only seen the literal of what's there. He has no concept, or doesn't appear to figure in anything about motivation, whether the person is acting as a result of a commandment by God, or like in the Jonah story where, he doesn't who is Jonah to judge what God does when he lacks knowledge of all of the things that God can, might, and wants to do. So because his framework is so narrow in what he sees, he then adopts a course of action, which in a way is equally narrow. He can't see that there's a possibility that something else is going on.
Interesting. I'm challenged, I think, by Jeff, the position that you're taking, and Dan, because I'm a little bit with Tom. If we aren't here to grade the universe, what is? So maybe there's a backstory of why it turned out that the person who kept the mother bird was a good person in a bigger lens, and the person who shoot away the mother bird actually really deserved to die because he was a tax cheat. But we know definitively that there are truly good people who suffer, that there isn't a logical moral equation that makes it okay for a 9-year-old to die of leukemia. There just isn't. And so looking at, the tragedies, big and small, recognizing that there isn't a bigger story that you can tell, I don't think, in which those things are rendered okay. Why not walk away from God in a world in which clearly reward and punishment are not being divvied out according to the morality that we recognize? I don't know. Luciana?
Hi. I want to just connect to the issue of Elisha being literal in this reading, right? Is that always the case at the time? Because if you're looking at it not only in a literal way, even if you don't need to think about motivation, but you can see that there's the possibilities of different results, and it could be kind of the beginning to look at what's coming forward, right? Maybe it could be like the combination of a person's life experiences and the choices the person makes that can add to something. But in this context, I think it highlights this major question, Rabbi, they're highlighting, but also it depends on whether it's a truly literal interpretation or there's more to it. But I want to add that religions like Buddhism and, spiritualists, right, that believe in reincarnation, that question then is resolved by the thinking that you grow up, right, as a soul. You learn through the hardships, and then you have opportunities later on to continue that process. It's not a total explanation for the world being what it is, but at least it gives some, I guess, reasoning for the inequalities that we see, like you just described.
Sure. And that's why most religions have posited an afterlife in which there is a balancing of the scales in one way or another. And yet one can still look at life's unfairness and say, is this Torah, and is this its reward? Thank you. Howard?
Well, I came in a bit late to this. I assume that you folks have talked about the as a driven leaf.
Yeah.
To me, in as a driven leaf, I think the author kind of presents Elisha as somebody who was starting to waver in his faith in the whole system of Judaism, even before he started to study mysticism with Akiva and the others. And I think that when you step outside the realm of pure logic and you go into things where you're not entirely sure what the rules are, you're liable to find what you're looking for. This is even true in quantum physics, because there's like, two things like position and momentum. You can look for one, you can look for the other, but the more you look for the one, the less you know about the other. And so you lose the balance. That's the essence of what God is probably trying to do in the universe, to me anyway, which is there's all these antinomies like justice and mercy, right? And the idea is you don't want to be all justice, because then there wouldn't be any mercy. You don't want to be all mercy, because then there wouldn't be any justice. You want to find the point in the middle somewhere, and it's always moving. But whatever it is, you want to find, for whatever state things are in, the most appropriate balancing point. And the problem is there's so many dimensions like this in reality that no person can do it. Only Hashem can do it. Because only Hashem has the ability to deal with this in an infinite number of dimensions. We only can do it in a very small number. And the problem that Elisha is facing, I think, is really the fault of the book of Genesis, because it says in Genesis chapter 1, now, or maybe it's chapter 2, now, if these people eat from the tree of knowledge, they will be like us, God says, knowing good and evil. And I think that creates, in all subsequent religious reference, an unfulfillable expectation for people. Yes, you can know something about good and evil, but you can't know what God knows. And what we call good and evil is something that comes from human development and human evolution and human experience. We don't get it directly from God. And if you did get it correctly from God, you couldn't understand it. So the issue to me is what he experiences while he's in the Pardes that makes him do this, that confirms his feeling, his unsettled feeling going into the Pardes. And I think that's it. He realized he couldn't understand it.
I am clearly in a theological minority here, which is totally fine. I do not profess to have the answers just because I'm the convener of the class. I am the convener for a collection of smart people to look at text. I'm just not moved by this whole idea of we don't actually know what good is and what bad is because God is playing million dimension chess. But that's great. Happy to be in the theological minority. I've been a holder of minority opinions for a long time. Josh, and then let's take a look at another text.
Sorry, I have to unmute first. I mean,
Look like Josh.
I know this might be along the lines of we don't know what's good and bad, but how do we know that death is necessarily a bad thing? Maybe the reward is it takes a real leap of faith. Don't get me wrong, but life is suffering sometimes. Maybe the person who is rewarded is the one who is no longer here and is in the world to come. Maybe the person who did sin, maybe their punishment is a long, miserable life. Who knows? I mean, I do think that there's an aspect of that, and that might be a cop-out, and I'm totally comfortable with saying that's a cop-out, but we don't really know. And the other aspect is, yes, the rabbi said that with Shiloh HaKhan, with, shooing the mother bird, that you are rewarded. Maybe the rabbis were wrong. Maybe that isn't a huge mitzvah, even though the rabbis maybe they got that one wrong. I mean, there's a lot of other contexts here that I feel like is missing, and we don't know what each person is destined for beyond that small scenario of one is dead, one isn't dead, right? They didn't get their comeuppance. it's like instant gratification for Elisha ben Abuya. We don't know the rest of the context at all. So I do feel like there's something missing, and maybe we're putting very simplistic, terms on what is what is a reward in a very humanistic way that goes beyond what we really can understand.
I really love you, Josh, and I really hate that answer, but I really love you. And I just can't go. Death is the good one. I can't go there. But again, so good to have a convening of smart people together, and so grateful to not have to play the Socratic thing where I just hold back and I can't say what I think. And let's look at the next text. Let's look at the next text and see if you can come along with me on this one. But fascinating. I am fascinated by this. I will be processing this for days. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Let's take a look at this next text. This also comes from the Talmud, from Hagiga. Rabbi Meir took Elisha and brought him to a schoolhouse. So this is taking place after, this is connected to the incident of going to the Pardes. And Rabbi Meir is the student of Elisha, and he is trying to bring his teacher back. From his heresy. So it's not exactly a story of how he loses faith, but it's a story of how I think he loses it for good. Rabbi Meir took Elisha and brought him to a schoolhouse. And he asked a certain child, "Tell me what verse you're learning." And the child answered, "There is no peace, says the Lord, for the wicked." Not such an inspiring line. So he took him to another synagogue, and he asked the child there, "Tell me what verse you're learning." And the child replied, "You may scrub yourself with lye. You may use as much soap as you please. Your iniquity is indelibly stained before me, says the Lord God." Oy, that's worse. He took him to another synagogue and repeated his request. And the child quoted a verse from Jeremiah. "What will you do, you ruined creature? Will you dress yourself in scarlet and wear golden jewelry and enlarge your eyes with paint? All you do is all in vain do you beautify yourself." And he took him to 13 synagogues, one after another, and each time he received a reply of this sort. And finally said to one child, "Tell me what verse you've learned." And the child answered, "But to the wicked, God says, what business have you reciting my laws or speaking about my covenant?" Now the child had a speech defect. He had a lisp. And when he said, "V'la rasha," to the wicked, it came out sounding like "V'la Elisha," to Elisha. Thought it was personal. But to Elisha, God says, "What business have you reciting my laws?" Some say that he had a knife with him and that he cut the child into pieces and sent those pieces to the 13 synagogues. But others say he only said, "If I had a knife, I would have cut him to pieces." That's a crazy story. Elisha's going from classroom to classroom, asking the students what they're learning as they're opening the holy book. It's supposed to teach us how to be good people in the world. And what do 13 out of 13 of them learn? Verses of condemnation. "You will never be clean, you foul creature. What business do you have reciting my laws, you wicked one?" And by the time he's done with 13 encounters with 13 children, all being taught a version of religion which is condemning, which is harsh, Elisha says, "I'm really out." How out am I? I'm out like I would cut these kids up if I could. I think what this story and the story of the person being bitten by a snake at Genasor have in common is, from where I sit, both of these are reactions to bad theology. Bad theology says that God is a condemning God interested in punishing and cutting off forever the wicked. And bad theology, in my not so humble opinion, says that bad things don't happen to good people, and good things don't happen to bad people. And if somebody has something bad happen to them, then logically they must deserve it on some level. I think that both of these theologies, both of which are really common to religion, not just our religion, but every expression of religion, both of these theologies are reasons that good people leave religion. Good people leave religion when they encounter in religion a voice of condemnation and not a voice of love. Good people leave religion when they encounter a voice that says, you are a disgusting sinner, rather than you are a child of the divine, made in God's image to bring more light to the world. People leave religion when they're told there's a reason for everything. And from that, they can only conclude that their losses, in addition to being losses, are now doubly painful because they're also punishments. I think those things drive good people away from religion. And I think that those two critiques of religion, which are offered out of the mouths of the Bill Maher's of the world and the Sam Harris's of the world and the many, many, many critics of religion who sell a lot of books being critics of religion, predicate their criticism of religion on the idea that all religious people buy in to these two frameworks. The religious people buy into a framework in which good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, which can be demonstrated to not be the case, and buy into a framework in which verses that exist in every sacred text that are verses of condemnation need to be taken literally and can't be reinterpreted and ought to be taught to children to memorize. That religion is a system of indoctrination rather than a cultivation of moral sense. Religion's critics have many good things to point to. They have many clear pieces of evidence that religion can be dangerous. And I think that makes it all the more important for those of us who continue to find meaning in religion to be able to look and acknowledge these places in which religion can be a dangerous force. And to, as I said at the beginning, rather than walk away as Alicia did, to lean in and to offer alternative ways of understanding. Howard and Lee, you've both gotten to share, and time is coming short, so let me give it to Diane first.
You know, my thoughts are, this so resonates with me, Rabbi, because I feel that religion often gets thrown off the tracks because of man. And I also feel that if we take the opportunity to question, I personally believe that is what God wants us to do, that we should not be accepting even what's in written, because we also know that man's been involved. And, you know, I remember very long ago when I was little going to United Hebrew Schools, and I remember one of my teachers saying, you know, you should not question God. And I remember at the age of 7 thinking, well, if that's so, why did God give me the ability to do it? But of course, I was too little and I didn't want to say anything. So I do feel that part of hearing this is for us to process and question. And by questioning it, it feels to me like it helps us go on the right path of really the essence of what religion is supposed to do, which is to make this a better world and a better place and make us better humans.
Said Diane, when we encounter that painful point, the question is that an invitation to go on a journey, or is that an end to a journey? Is this painful verse or this painful idea a jumping off point to exploration, or an ending point past which you can't reasonably go? And the tragedy of Alicia is that he encounters these various points and he makes them the end of his story rather than the beginning. And the redemption of Alicia comes in the fact that the rabbis pass down his stories so that we can look at them and they can be for us jumping off points even if Elisha couldn't himself do that. We're at time. I feel like I need to, because I allowed myself to get emotionally invested here and say, I kind of need to give you the last text because it agrees with the people who I disagreed with. And let's give Rambam the last word. So if you can't stay, that's totally fine. And it's a little long, but I won't use more than 10 minutes, I promise. And if you've got to go, you got to go. Because Rambam's answer here is what leads Elisha off the derech, off the path, is requiring certainty, is trying to understand beyond his ability. Rambam is a doctor, remember, in addition to a philosopher and a rabbi. So listen to this passage from the Guide for the Perplexed, hearing it both from the perspective of a philosopher rabbi and also from the perspective of a physician. When you look with your eye, you see what you're capable of apprehending. If, however, you force your eyes to do something they don't wish to do, like staring for a long period, or looking for something in the far distance, or trying to read tiny writing, something that's beyond their power to apprehend, your eyes shall not only be too weak to see the thing clearly, but also too weak to apprehend what is normally in their power to see. But if you look normally with your eyes, provided your eyes work as they should, you can see. But if you strain your eyes, you not only lose the ability to see the thing you're straining to see, but you actually lose your normal vision as well. Something similar can happen with your intellectual endeavors. If you admit the doubt and do not persuade yourself to believe that there is proof for things which cannot be demonstrated, or to try at once to reject and positively deny an assertion the opposite of which has never been proved, or attempt to perceive things which are beyond your perception, then you will have attained the highest degree of human perfection. Then you're like Rabbi Akiva, who in peace entered in peace and came out in peace. If you're able to accept that you can't see everything, that you don't know the full picture, that's the peace that Rabbi Akiva had that allowed him to go in and to come back out. You have to embrace the doubt. If, on the other hand, you attempt to exceed the limit of your intellectual power, or at once to reject things as impossible which have never been proved to be impossible, or which are in fact possible, but their possibility is very remote, then you'll be like Elisha Acher. You will not only fail to become perfect, you will become exceedingly imperfect. Ideas founded on mere imagination will prevail over you, and you will incline toward defects, toward base and degraded habits, on account of the confusion which troubles the mind, and of the dimness of its light, just as weakness of sight causes invalids to see many kinds of unreal images, especially when they've looked for a long time at dazzling or very minute objects. If you need to be sure, if you think you know everything, that will cloud your perception and make it actually, ironically, less likely that you'll know anything. With regard to this, it's been written, have you found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for you, then stop, lest you vomit it. Remember that from the first text we read? In a similar way, the sages use this proverb as an analogy for Elisha Acher. How marvelous is this parable, since it compares acquiring knowledge to eating. It also mentions the most delicious of foods, honey. However, honey, if eaten to excess, it is its nature to cause stomach upset. That is, in spite of how sublime it is, its greatness and perfection, the intellectual pursuit, if not made to respect its proper limit and not conducted with circumspection, it may be perverted into a defect, just like honey. For whereas the individual by eating in moderation is nourished, it all goes away if there's too much. Accordingly, Scripture doesn't say, lest you be filled and come to hate it, rather that you will vomit it. That if you try to take it all in, all of it without limit, if you think that you can know everything, can be, as Howard pointed out, truly knowing good and evil like one of the gods, then ultimately your pursuit is going to lead you nowhere, maybe to a sore belly. That So I just think I think that text is fascinating. That idea that the intellectual pursuit always has to be tempered with some humility, with some recognition of doubt. And that what leads Elisha astray is that Elisha doesn't doubt. He's a man of such intense conviction of that he can understand things in their entirety. That he can understand what he saw Metatron doing in the seventh heaven, or he can understand exactly why it was that one person was rewarded and one person was punished, that he can extrapolate, as Dan was telling us and others were telling us, from small incidents to big, broad generalizations about the universe. And in that way, he finds himself unable to continue in the religious life because he is too sure of himself. And to be in relationship with God and to be as a part of the spiritual tradition, one needs to maintain the room that says they don't know everything. So it's an important corrective on me, right? It's an important corrective on all of us. I on one hand, clearly, react very strongly to the idea of we can't know good and bad in that particular theology. And on the other hand, I need to be reminded that I don't know everything. And that those two things, that sense of moral conviction and that also awareness of a bigger mystery, have to find some way to coexist in me. And I think have to find some way to coexist in all of us who choose to be a part of these traditions and these systems of ideas. Happy to bring in some reactions. Howard, were you wanting to share or hand up from before?
Sure. I guess my feeling is that how do I put it? You cannot live without faith in something because that's what generates hope when everything else is gone. But once you realize that you don't know everything, you can't know everything. You can only know what's practical for you to know to help you survive. That's what God means when God says, do this so that you will live long in the land that I'm giving you. It doesn't mean you're always going to live long, but it means you're going to improve the probability of surviving. And why? Because this is the approximation that is the most likely to help you on the planet you're on, in the situation you're on, with the other people and animals and stuff that are there, to keep the ecosystem going. Right? The problem to me, I don't understand why that destroys faith. To me, that's the best foundation for faith, is that you've got to, the faith can't just be intellectual, it has to be emotional. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to have faith that this is going to work out because I have faith in God to know what I don't know. I don't understand why that doesn't exactly follow, or why this is necessarily an anti something that calls faith into question. I think it bolsters it.
Thank you. Luciana, then Sharon.
Oh, I was unmuted. I'm sorry. It's more of a question or clarification. When you were reading the text, I imagined that it wasn't just one individual's ability to know everything, it's more like the humanity. So scientists that believe in the metaphysical, that are religious, right? Most will say that things that we can't explain, we might be able to explain them. But until that point, we believe in them or not based on faith. So there may be things they'll never know, but there's always this hope that, like in the past, we'll continue to explain things before they weren't explainable. So it's more of like not a certainty that humans can know everything, but more this idea that, we just haven't gotten there yet. And there meaning a certain point where then after that we might not ever. So just more of a question about this. Is this an individual perspective of, relative to the other one, be kind of satisfied with what you have? And so it's just something that I, got a little confused.
Yeah, it's a really interesting read of it. And I want to have enough humility to say I don't know precisely what the Rambam means here.
Mhm.
But I'll say that in general, he's usually talking about the individual, because his project is the perfection of human intellectual character such that they are able to connect with the divine. So he's really interested in teaching his reader, his very elite cadre of readers, how to be capable of being philosophers like him. And I think in this passage, he is saying, be cautious of one of the dangers that, as we talked about in the last class, he himself often fell into, of thinking you know everything. So I think it's a moment of either a moment of self-reflection for the Rambam, in which he recognizes this danger, or even a moment that just underlines his lack of self-reflection, that he could write this and also at the same time say, some of the other things he says. But I do think that he's directing this for the individual rather than the sum of humanity, though it's interesting to read it that way and to see what this would mean if it was directed in terms of the progression of human knowledge. That human knowledge collectively is always going to be limited in some way. Yeah, Sharon, please.
I just have this to add. I don't know if it's that succinct or anything, but it seems to me that if life is kind of a school where we learn things, we learn rules and we learn direction and we learn who's supposedly good and who's supposedly bad and how they're going to get punished and stuff, it's still also a world where God gives us, fortunately, free will. So that if we're good or if we're bad, we can still choose, and we can often choose something that seems like the right thing to do, and it's an error. So to categorize things as good and bad versus it's an error, or fortunately something else didn't get in our way and that was good or bad, is, I think, part of the complexity of the situations that the rabbis get themselves into when they're trying to judge everything by what some saying is from religious writing or something, or God said this or God said that. It's almost quoting God out of context, because there are words that are said in particular situations, and if applied to another one, it may not relate, or there may be subterfuge by the person involved in that particular situation outside of the context of the written word. So that when the kids are just reciting these things, they're reciting different things that happened, and this is a singular saying. And then combined with all the other ones, and their free will is people to do things. That's what they're learning. More importantly, they're getting direction, they're getting teaching, but they're also supposed to become more wise. And by being wise, they can use their free will to follow the good. And if it fails, they can say, oh, well, that's not because God's bad and God is compassionate, but that unfortunately that situation worked out poorly. And I'm saying this is just a general idea besides what we're reading today. And that's just my thought on it. It's not like it solves any problem or anything.
One of the things that I think that I was very lucky to learn, because I, as some of you will know, won the parent lottery, which I recognize, is a position of great privilege. Most people don't. I won the parent lottery. And one of the things that I learned from my parents was that rigid things break and flexible things survive. And that an attitude of rigidity and narrowness is an attitude which is playing defense, and an attitude which ultimately doesn't get you particularly far at all. I think Alicia is rigid. I think he has a very clear sense of a black and white world. And when things don't comport to his black and white world, he can't live in that world. He only has the choice of walking away from it. He sees a vision of heaven, and he has a very rigid idea of what monotheism means. And the second he sees Metatron, he says, then the whole thing must be bunk. He has a very rigid idea of reward and punishment. And the first time he encounters a counterproof to that, the whole thing must be bunk. He's got this rigidity, which I think is what Rambam is alluding to, this sense of knowing it all. And when we're rigid, it's very easy to have the ground pulled out from under us and for everything to come toppling down. And so I try very hard in my life to practice a flexible Judaism and to live a flexible approach in which there is more than one way to be a human and more than one way to approach God and more than one way to parent a child and more than one way to approach the world. And I hope that that more flexible position isn't misread as being wishy-washy. I hope that that more flexible position is understood to be, I don't know, a more grounded and solid way of approaching a mysterious big world. That to me very much is the legacy of my parents' teaching in me. And so I think when I approach Alicia and see him as a warning, it's a warning about getting too rigid. It's a warning about locking into there's only one way that something could be, and if that one way is shaken, then the whole thing needs to fall apart. Let's leave it there. Have a great night, guys. See you again in a couple weeks.